Know someone in your life celebrating a birthday? They deserve to feel truly celebrated. That's what 1-800-Flowers has helped people do for 50 years, turning everyday gestures into meaningful moments of connection. And this April, during their 50th birthday celebration event, when you buy one bouquet, get a second bouquet 50% off. Celebrate more birthdays with our 50th birthday event all April long at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. Buy one bouquet, get a second bouquet 50% off at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare, anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare, anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I had a very light week compared to you prior to recording this episode, so maybe I'm a little rested. Got to, have a mini vacation from research on my end.
Yes, we've switched things up a little bit for this episode and our prior episode on Julius Caesar, where one of us took the bulk of research and the other one got a little bit of a break. And I say a little bit of a break because I know that the intent was also that we were doing things behind the scenes.
Yes,
you have been editing and working on some additional things for the podcast. I've been doing things like making sure our business taxes are paid.
I don't envy your admin work.
But it's really exciting. I'm so excited to talk to you today about what I've titled the episode is How Often Did William Shakespeare Think About the Roman Empire? Because there's that meme today of men think about the Roman Empire once a day. And what we wanted to dig into, especially in contrast to what you presented last time, which was a history of the events of Julius Caesar's life and the assassination of Julius Caesar, was to look at how did early modern people understand this? How widespread was this knowledge? And what might Shakespeare have known? What might people of his time have thought about the Roman Empire? So we're going to dig into that more, but first we do have some housekeeping. First up, we have some new Patreon patrons to thank. As we always like to remind you, our podcast is listener supported, and the support comes primarily from our Patreon patrons. So thanks, and ever thanks to Mark C.,
Jenny T.,
and Stephanie, our newest members of Patreon.
Yes, thank you so much for joining our community over on Patreon and for supporting the podcast.
Also, quick little announcement, we are going to have a birthday sale for our merch store. It starts a couple days after this episode drops. So from April 17th through May 1st, 2026, all orders are 10% off. That is in celebration of Courtney's birthday, my birthday, Shakespeare's birthday, and the 1-year anniversary of us launching our merch store. So again, 10% off. It'll automatically be taken off. All you have to do is go to www.shakespeareanyone.com/shop and fill your cart with maybe our iambic pentameter hat or one of our Coriolanus wine glasses. Why Coriolanus? Because there's a line in there that says wine, 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 and it is the perfect quote to put on a wine glass. Maybe our Prince Hal pint glass.
Why is that the perfect play to put up on a...
Because he does enjoy the small beer.
Yeah, we're clever over there on our merch shop. Basically, if Elise or I have any sort of idea, we're like, this thing that I really want that's Shakespeare related is not on merch on Etsy. Who is going to make it?
We're
We're
going to
going to
make
make
it.
it. Yes.
And we are going to share it and make it available to you. So again, 10% off all orders April 17th through May 1st, 2026, www.shakespeareanyone.com/shop. And last but not least, something really fun happened over this past month. In addition to winning our Shakespeare Association of America Publics Award, we were invited onto Cap Radio's Insight with Vicky Gonzalez. Cap Radio is an NPR station here in Sacramento, and we got to talk to Vicky about the podcast, the work that we do. If you want to listen to our segment, the link is in our link tree at the bottom of our episode description.
Yes, it was a really great time getting to talk to Vicky, and it was also really cute because both of us are from the Sacramento area, and I told my parents that we were going to be on Insight, and they were like, "Oh, from 12 p.m. to 1? Okay, we are going to go ahead and listen to it." So, it's really fun being, from the area and being invited on to talk about the podcast and share it with where we grew up. So, but you can listen to it even if you're not from Sacramento, you can listen to it. Like Elise said, it is in our link tree. It's a really fun segment. Very exciting and very proud. A very proud Sacramentan.
Yeah, you'll get to hear, if you haven't heard before, a little bit of the story of how the podcast came to be. So, Courtney, you ready to learn a little bit more about what the early moderns thought about the Roman Empire?
Yes, I want to make a prediction though beforehand.
Oh, yeah.
So I did no research. This is one that I'm going into like relatively research blind. But based on what we know from just doing the podcast over the past 5 years and being engaged in all sorts of, Shakespeare adjacent things, I feel like the early moderns thought a lot about the Roman Empire. I know that there was a lot of publishing and translations happening at the time period. And we have quite a few plays that are based on Roman stories. And so my prediction is that they were very, very obsessed with it as humanists, but I don't know how that came to be. And I'm really excited to learn about the nitty-gritty details that you are going to bring to us for this episode.
Well, great. I hope I lived up to it. The majority of my reading comes from Freyja Jensen's 2012 book, Reading the Roman Republic in Early Modern England, where she looks at just what we've sort of been hoping to learn more about. What did people in the early modern era think about Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire? Where did these ideas come from? How widespread was this knowledge? And can we tell why it was so popular? And we know this. We know that there's definitely some interest, there's some pull. I will talk a little bit about printing later. I'm so glad you brought that up. But there is also this myth, I'm going to say, of specifically Shakespeare not being well-versed in Latin. This sort of argument that people think that he didn't know much about Rome or his knowledge was questionable. And that knowledge of Rome kind of doesn't matter for Shakespeare because he's a playwright and he's inventing things and it's not sticking true to Plutarch. We've sort of touched on this throughout our series and throughout our podcast of he takes artistic liberties, yes. But that does not mean that his knowledge is lacking. And one thing that I'm going to talk about today a few times is how the early moderns thought of history in general. We have to reframe how we think of history in general. But before I get into that, I do want to start off with just sort of answering the question of, were they obsessed? Like you said, longtime listeners are going to be like, yeah, probably, right? Just the amount of volume of knowledge that we have. Jensen says, quote, "It is clear from the way that references to characters from classical history were presented that a knowledge of ancient history was assumed to be already present in a large proportion of the reading audience, be the readers publicly or independently educated," unquote. We can also tell from, in addition to the printing that you talked about and the amount of plays, we can tell from inventories of private book collections, university library catalogs and records, and commonplace books kept by early modern readers that Rome was a major interest for many, most early modern readers, both men and women.
It's funny, that makes me just think about today how there's bursts where our consciousness of history is we're really interested in the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
And then we are collectively really interested in because of Jurassic Park, there's, paleontology. And then because of this movie, collectively we as a society are interested in this time period. So it's just you're saying like it was widespread for men and women,
Hmm.
just pretty big.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking about like how that some things haven't changed.
Yes, some things haven't changed. Early modern England's not a monolith. Some of our favorite like touchstones throughout our podcast are going to come back a few times in this. So Julius Caesar had sort of like the cultural capital in early modern England that you could say a figure like Shakespeare has today, where it's just omnipresent.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you like it or not,
Mm-hmm.
whether you engage directly with it or not, content that you consume and people that you encounter are going to be referencing it. People in your life are going to know it. Rome exists in early modern England's like imagination in a unique way. So England had once been subject to Rome. So there was this sort of myth of a Brutus, not the Brutus in the play, who was the founder of England or the conqueror of England, the land that is now known as England. And additionally, Cox Jensen notes, quote, as a small state which expanded to conquer the known world, Rome provided a model of imperial expansion for Britannia as the new world horizons became ever broader, unquote.
Whoa.
So not only are we like getting some of the just renewed interest because of humanists and because of the Renaissance, but also England is starting to really look at Rome, at ancient Rome, as like this source of knowledge for themselves and paragons to model themselves after, examples to follow. Additionally, in the early modern world, Latin was a universal language. Quote, the language of learning and a medium in which men of different nations could communicate, and it was important that boys should learn it at school for use in later life, in higher education, in politics, or in business, unquote. So the language of Rome also permeated society, and if you were engaging in certain levels of society, you pretty much had to speak some level of Latin, and it was taught. I'll dig into how that education worked in a little bit. And just because things were classic and ancient, they were imbued with this sense of authority just because they were old.
Right.
And Cox Jensen compares this to classical Rome read texts that they held up as like guides to life. They sort of read them through a lens of prophecy in which their modern day could be understood through prophecy from the past, right? Which assured them that like they were working through some divine plan. In early modern England, history filled a similar role of a thing that the culture used to help understand their present day. Does that make sense?
That does, yeah. Because you're saying that in classic like ancient Rome, there was this like divine prophecy that was used as a way to view the world and understand the world.
And like divine history of the past, like historical divine prophecy, they would read and look back on and interpret their current events through those lenses of like, oh, you see, that's what that prophecy meant. Therefore, what is happening today isn't so wild. It is actually part of divine plan and evidence that we are on the right path.
Yeah, a society that was really like had myths and like oracles and things like that.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. This is sort of like not so much has changed, right?
Yeah.
Like the ancient Rome to early modern version is in ancient Rome. They look to this, to oracles and myth and prophecy that was that was handed down. And in early modern England, they're looking at the histories of ancient Rome for the same sort of like
direction.
Yeah. It was believed that through reading the classics, early modern readers could glean wisdom for their own lives. And this all sort of stems from it has the roots in how people, I'm going to use men and he, him a lot because students at this time were men and boys who were going to the grammar schools and the universities. But in the like late 1400s, early 1500s, there's this new age of pedagogical theory led by scholars and Protestant leaders like Erasmus, who emphasize an education in history. Erasmus stressed that, quote, history must be grasped. There is no branch of knowledge which is not useful for those who have undertaken an exposition of the ancient poets or orators, unquote. And it was believed that through acts of imitation and repetition, scholars at all levels were expected to engage with classical texts to seek meaning for the present day. Again, that's sort of like looking back and gleaning knowledge for themselves. Quote, from the reign of Henry VIII on, educational theorists conceived of a classical education as a means to creating a political class that would serve the crown and were keen to stress the importance of education in creating men who would work for the good of the common weal, unquote. So education was seen as this like moral imperative to create good members of society who could serve their monarch. And this education was grounded in studying the classics. What did that look like in practice? Well, okay. At the grammar schools, boys as young as 6 received a largely Latin education, which laid the groundwork for further learning in adulthood if they went on to university. A typical day of grammar school at Eton at the end of Elizabeth's reign, which is like a top-tier grammar school, looked like this. 5 a.m., the boys wake up. 6 a.m., they have morning prayers, conjugation of Latin verbs, reading out loud in Latin. 7 a.m., they have repetition of the material they had just read. 8 a.m., they're busy translating Latin at levels of various difficulty depending on their level of ability with Latin. At 9 a.m., they were read a lecture and then were required to write the main themes of that lecture in Latin. Then they had prayers and a meal break. And in the afternoon, they continued lessons in Latin grammar, composition, and translation until 5 p.m. when they had another meal break. At 6 p.m., they had more Latin lessons until 7 p.m., at which time they broke again. And at 8 p.m., they were in bed, good night, to do it all over again the next day.
And it's wild to think that they probably, spoke English with their family, but in school, they're primarily really working in Latin.
Additionally, not only are they primarily speaking in Latin in their classes, they were also required to speak only Latin with one another when they were on study breaks in class. So this is full Latin immersion. And they could not move into higher levels of their courses until they had sufficiently mastered the level of Latin they were on. Only after they perfected grammar, epistolary composition, prose, rhetorical composition, then verse composition, would they be permitted to even study Greek, Hebrew, and logic. And those 3 subjects were hardly studied at all at the grammar school level because it was so rigorous to pass Latin.
Wow. And the things that you're all listing off, you teed us up for this. Shakespeare uses all of those in his plays.
Yes. And you might be thinking, but Elise, this is Eton. This is the rich boy school. This is not Shakespeare's grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon. But curriculum was, quote, remarkably consistent, unquote, despite huge variation in, quote, size and finances of the grammar schools, unquote. This meant that, if you went to school, no matter where you went, there was a shared literary culture amongst every single young man who went to a grammar school.
So you can't be classist about whether you went to the top tier school or you went to the local country school.
I mean, you can probably still be a little classist about it, but you're going to share the same references. You're going to have the same, what do you think about Ovid? You're going to be able to engage in that level of conversation.
Yeah, I guess I mean people who study it and look at it. They can't be classist about Shakespeare's Stratford countryside school versus Eton. But
Yes. For a little bit more on that, here's what Cox Jensen has to say. Quote, "The reading of texts which imparted a flavor of the late Roman Republic was a constant feature of even the smallest establishments. Although some grammar schools only had one teacher, they used the same pedagogical methods as the major public schools, aiming to teach exactly the same material. While it is doubtful that a universally high standard of Latin was achieved throughout the country, the very system that required boys to spend a large part of every day in contact with Roman writings demonstrably contributed to the formation of a literate sector of society whose values and mental world were of a strongly classical bent." Unquote. So, sort of what you were saying of the individual student and the quality of the school could impact it, but the curriculum was the same across England.
Yeah, maybe someone, if we're thinking about today, maybe if you go to a more prestigious school, maybe your understanding of a Shakespeare play is a certain level that's different than if you studied it at your local public school. But if both schools are teaching Romeo and Juliet, they're gonna...
all the students are going to be exposed to Romeo and Juliet.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Cicero, Caesar, and Sallust were taught universally, and then the majority of schools also taught Terence, Virgil, Ovid, and Horace. Material could have been presented in English or Latin for translation, or Latin as an example of rhetorical excellence. So even those schools that don't have that have one teacher who's doing their best but is not the Latin expert at Eton, has access to maybe English versions of these works to help translate or to help them navigate the translation evaluations that their students are doing. The Erasmian style of teaching fell out of fashion, but that only meant that it, quote, became more common to provide English translations of Cicero for boys to turn back into Latin, which could then be compared to the original, unquote. Rather than, as Erasmus's pedagogical practices sort of fall out of favor, they don't turn to another big text in Latin, is the Bible. Educators do not turn to that as something that like students should be using for Latin because a later influential educationalist, John Brinsley, said in the early 1600s, he condemned, quote, the translation of passages from the Bible as leading to poor Latin style, unquote. And Brinsley was one of those educationalists who also produced a translation of Cicero's De Officiis to support less skilled schoolmasters. So you have the leaders of what we would call like thought leaders of education today. Even after Erasmus, they are still advocating that like looking at these ancient Roman texts, these ancient Roman histories, is a better source for Latin, and you learn better Latin than using the Bible.
Okay.
So a boy who had studied these texts would go through school and end up with a, quote, complete familiarity with the landscape of Roman history, unquote. So just going through grammar school, you are well versed in Roman history. If for students who moved on to university, both Cambridge and Oxford required Latin in order to graduate and had curriculums that were defined by a statute. So like it was written down that you had to do it at Cambridge. The first year had to do rhetoric. The second and third years were spent focused on dialectic. And the fourth years included the study of philosophy. So like what you studied, you had to study Rome, you had to study Latin, and it was prescribed. What exactly you read was left up to the teachers at Cambridge. At Oxford, the compulsory Latin components amounted to a total of 6 of the 16 terms that you spent at Oxford, and required reading of Virgil, Horace, and Cicero in addition to Aristotle. So the universities also are requiring deeper study in Latin and in reading these ancient texts.
I don't know the exact proportion of the population, but you have like a portion of the male population that is learning it, whether they're at least at grammar school and then beyond in university. And I'm sure that those people told people about what they were studying. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there we do have evidence of, like I said, like I'm referring to them as like boys and men because that is the majority of who's going to these schools. But we do also have evidence that like women did read, women did interact with these texts. But we just have a lot more information on what was happening in the schools.
Yeah.
So in the wake of the Reformation, universities saw a decline in the faculties of law and theology, which, quote, coincided with and contributed to the growth in prestige and power of the arts faculty, changing the demography of the universities, which increasingly became the providers of education to younger men, the undergraduates, unquote. So alongside this growing interest in Rome and studying Latin is the Reformation sees fewer and fewer older students going to study law and theology, which are, even today would be terminal degrees, like your master's programs, and the undergraduate classes at Cambridge and Oxford start to grow alongside the Bachelor of Arts department, the liberal arts departments. So as I was mentioning earlier, very little like actual material was required by statute, which allowed and encouraged tutors, so the teachers, to develop additional independent reading courses for their students. Students, quote, read mainly classical texts and read them in a humanist framework for the lessons in morality and ethics they contained and for their precepts of political philosophy and civic virtue, unquote. How did they do this? Through this practice of zooming in even further, what did this learning practice actually look like? A key feature of the learning practice was note-taking and commonplacing. Students in grammar school and university were trained in what is known as the commonplacing tradition, which was an important element to the early modern reading process. Commonplacing required the student to organize material from his reading and was believed to enable the student to acquire, quote, a body of humanistic knowledge that would allow him to participate actively and virtuously in the political world, unquote. Additionally, quote, commonplace habits were thought to improve oratory and prose composition and expose the truth within the ancient texts, unquote. So students were encouraged to comb through these texts and, quote unquote, harvest and excerpt that which they found particularly noteworthy. And then they would preserve it in a notebook. They used 2 notebooks. In the classic note-taking and commonplacing model, a student had two notebooks simultaneously. They would take initial notes in one, and then the second would be the commonplacing, where they would organize these quotes that they found in their note-taking and organize them into theme. And those themes would be things like virtues and vices, like quotes on love, quotes on pride, quotes on patience.
Mm-hmm.
And notes were supposed to be gathered while reading a text, as this was believed to help personalize the learning while also proving to the tutor that work was being done.
Any proof?
Yes. However, quote, in practice, students often copied large sections of classical works into their notebooks for use in future exercises, rather than emulating the great writers of the past in any more sophisticated or abstract sense, unquote. So they just are copying and pasting like large sections of text that are like, this could be potentially useful, and just putting it into a notebook and then filing it under a theme. There's no like an additional analysis done in these commonplace books.
Mm-hmm. Some things haven't changed working with students.
There's also no like, ooh, let me like try and write my own original work, which I'll come back to the idea.
Or I disagree with this person. Let me disagree with them.
Explain why.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not happening in these commonplace books and in their notes. Commonplacing, however, was a practice that, quote, stayed with educated readers throughout their lives, unquote. So somebody who had been through grammar school maintains this practice of commonplacing the rest of their life as they continue to read.
I wish we had William Shakespeare's commonplacing notebooks.
I know. Yeah.
Lost to history.
He lost to history. So here's what they were reading. Appian's Roman History, Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Civil War, Cassius Dio's Roman History, Florus's Epitome of Roman History, Lucan's Pharsalia, Pliny the Elder's Natural History, Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Sallust's Conspiracy of Catiline, Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, and Velleius Paterculus's Roman History. Cox Jensen notes, quote, not all of these authors wrote what we might think of as history, nor did they define their works thus. In the ancient world, history proper was a large-scale analysis of important events and developments, and the discussion of constitutional change over large periods of time. Yet, in the early modern period, all of these could broadly be claimed as histories, historical writings, dealing with historia, narrating the deeds of men. Literature and history were more or less synonymous, both providing moral lessons and examples on which a Christian man could draw in order to learn how to live a more virtuous life, unquote. So, yeah, these are not like all just like pure historiographies. But in the early modern era, that's what they were considered. There was also a growing demand for vernacular translations, and from 1550 to the middle of the 1600s, nearly all of the classical authors were made available in English for the first time. Indeed, quote, throughout the Elizabethan and early Stuart era, there was a growing interest in Roman history, not only in the schools and universities, but among wider sectors of literate society, unquote. So, as you mentioned, like, there is a large demand for these works, not only for studying at school because you're learning Latin, but the broader non-Latin literate population is interested in accessing these as well. Additionally, compared to the rest of Europe across all forms of writing, quote, the rest of Europe printed roughly the same proportion of titles in Latin as in the vernacular. England, on the other hand, printed over 5 times as many English translations as Latin titles, unquote. Translation during this time also developed from being a strong rhetorical style with less concern for reproducing the idiom of original Latin to our sort of more modern sense of translation, which involves a level of literary authority for the translator and the translator working to preserve not only the literal text, the literal words, but is more trying to preserve the meaning. Think Emily Wilson's The Odyssey.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
The differences and the authorial liberty that she took to change things versus how they had been classically translated before. So prior to this, it was literally like word by word, what does this say, without necessarily preserving the sense. Some of the more poetic idioms and
expressions, maybe.
Expressions, yeah. To spend just a quick moment on printing, since we've mentioned it a few times. In addition to nearly all of the classical authors being made available in English, all of the texts were available as printed books published in either England or in Europe, or through, quote, the digests and compilations prepared in later antiquity and the medieval period, unquote. The 1500s and 1600s saw the production of anthologies and syntheses, quote, some designed as introductions for less advanced readers, others scholarly works for use by the academic community, unquote. And English presses could not keep up with the volume of demand, and the grammar schools specifically had to rely on European imports for textbooks until later in the 1500s, when textbooks began to be printed domestically. But even then, those were reprints of works previously imported. They were not like new works being printed for the first time in England. They were just keeping up with demand.
Yeah.
England continued to grow their production of Roman texts through the 1500s and 1600s, and Caesar specifically was the most popular in the 1590s and early 1600s.
Huh, what happened in the 1590s, 1600s? What's going on?
A transition?
Yeah.
A power transition?
Yeah.
Now I'm going to dig into sort of like, okay, cool, like that's how they got this. So the information was really widespread. You were steeped in it if you were in school. Everybody knew a little something about Roman history, pretty much. If you read, you knew Roman history. And if you didn't read, you probably heard something about Roman history from one of these Roman history nerds that you lived amongst, right?
Yeah.
But what did they sort of think about it in general? And this is where I'm going to get into something I talked about briefly earlier of like, there was a very big difference between how early moderns read history and how we, and probably the ancient Romans, look at history today. Pedagogical techniques, quote, gave impetus to the generally disintegrative approach to text suggested by humanist philosophy. Erasmus exhorted the reader to focus on the important passages in a text, rather than the whole, unquote. And this Erasmian theory, quote, informed the reading of history throughout the early modern period. Fragmentation and excerpting replaced the need to read everything. The whole was less important than the individual parts from which it was constructed, unquote. So their understanding of history was not, let's look at the whole, let's look at the forest, and focus on understanding how event A leads to event Z. It was, let's look at event M. What can we learn from event M? Event K. What can we learn from event K? Without necessarily connecting the dots between them.
It reminds me of like the way that I did a lot of English stuff when I was in high school, where it's like, we're going to read a passage, but we're going to separate it from like the whole book.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know.
Yeah. That's a podcast that focuses on putting things in context.
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know about this Erasmus.
Don't know about this.
This is Erasmus, right?
Yeah. This starts with Erasmus. Yeah.
I'm not sure about this Erasmus pedagogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this interpretive self-study means that scholars could find, quote, any number of potential meanings in ancient history. Opinion held that the virtuous would discern the correct meaning, while the bad would misread the text, unquote.
And how do you know if someone's virtuous or bad?
How do you well, you're either wrong or you're right on all things, right?
Yeah.
They also believed that history should be taught to students in small doses, and by they I mean educational theorists. So they believe that it should follow this natural sequence where you read summaries and introductions before approaching full texts or diving into details. So understand the framework, then go into detail. But again, not necessarily connecting. But again, sometimes the summary was enough. Oh, and now let's go look at a quote that like proves the summary.
Yeah.
And commonplacing reflected the early modern conceptions of rhetoric. Quote, built upon classical foundations of imitatio, encouraged the view that works of literature were essentially composed of many distinct particles arranged into a whole. These small parts were endlessly recycled, and originality had little to do with the process of writing. Rather than aiming at new creations, writers sought to reuse safe stock material in new ways, for this material was the sum total of inherited human wisdom, stored over centuries, and it could not be bettered. Boys were taught to write Latin by imitating the great authors. They excerpted certain phrases, the phrases we find recurring in the commonplace books, then incorporated these into their own prose writing. Such systemic felony may seem alien in today's society where plagiarism is a prominent concern and creativity is bound up with ideas of novelty and originality. But in early modern England, the process of learning by copying classical examples was highly respected, unquote.
And who do we talk about that does that time and time again?
Over and over and over
Over
again.
and over and over again.
Again, this is how people are being taught to write.
Right.
The way that Shakespeare writes and the reuse of stock characters and the recycling of plots and plots that seem similar to another playwright. We've talked about this briefly before of this is sort of like his version of Tamburlaine or like his reaction to Tamburlaine. Or, there's that scene in John Lilly's Galatea that is almost like a beat for beat, which beat for beat Shakespeare copies in the introduction of Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Not line for line, but like structurally,
Right.
it is the same scene. And also it's funny to think about like the idea that's out there of Shakespeare being this like genius who's writing it completely original. And it's like, not only is that ridiculous because we can point to, you know, this web of other work out there that pre-existed him that he is drawing from, but also that is not how people wrote during this time. And it's not what they were concerned about. They didn't care about plagiarism in the way that we do today.
No.
They didn't care about originality in the way that we do today. They wanted to see the King's Men version of a revenge tragedy or Shakespeare's version of, you know, a taming play.
Yeah.
As we've talked about. Yeah.
And today we do the exact same thing where we say, oh, I'm going to go see the National Theater's A Midsummer. I'm going to go see my local wineries or my local summer stock theater's version of Midsummer. Like,
yeah,
you've already seen it and you're going to see it by other people to see how they do it.
Again, in some ways, all art recycles, right? Like in music, there's the idea of interpolation, taking a fragment of another song and working it in a new way, but it still comes from it, you know, something that pre-existed the song that you're working on. It's all similar. Art is reacting to, you know, we got to understand art works differently than being wholly original.
Yeah, yeah.
And commonplacing and note-taking suggests that early modern readers read and reread texts throughout their life and revisited them and found new things in them. Quote, readers might draw any of a number of possible conclusions from their reading, and their interpretations were not necessarily fixed, unquote. So another fixture of early modern reading culture is, in addition to being able to sort of like see things as like made up of fragments, I sort of think of it as like they see the trees, not the forest the whole time.
Right.
And they think, how can I use this tree? They also have the ability to hold multiple ideas at the same time. So they will pull a quote that says Julius Caesar is a tyrant, and they will also pull quotes that are like Julius Caesar was a good guy. And they'll be like, both are noteworthy. Versus, I think, like today, especially like in the online echo chambers that exist, like the idea of being able to hold two thoughts at the same time feels maybe a little bit more foreign to how we understand the world today, right?
Yeah, there are like contradictions and complexities and nuance.
Yeah.
I don't know if the early moderns were nuanced, but either way.
But they were able to sort of like parse out all these different aspects and hold on to them at the same time, even if they contradicted each other.
Right.
Additionally, can you guess which period of Roman history early modern writers engaged most frequently with?
I'm guessing the like late Republic with Julius Caesar and that entire time period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Across all this writing, it is the ending of the Roman Republic to the establishment of the empire under Augustus Caesar. And it's also interesting to note that like as they are harvesting these like gems of wisdom in their commonplace books and they are pulling the quotes that they want to like save for for their future lives, many of the like paragons and exemplars that they turn to in Roman history are often very different from the sort of like Christian moral code that they're supposed to be living by, right? Because Rome wasn't living in Protestant England. Julius Caesar specifically, early modern readers were obsessed with Julius Caesar, like overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
And there are writings that like criticize him for his promiscuity and his ambition and sort of specifically the conflict with Pompey and Pompey himself. Quote, seems to have been thought worthwhile as commonplacing material by readers who were looking for lessons about the evils of civil war and of tyrants, unquote. So a lot of quotes about tyrants and the evils of civil war, like Caesar and Pompey, are featured heavily. So readers are able to criticize Caesar for his flaws. They're also able to see his virtues and hold, as I've been saying, those opposing ideas about Caesar simultaneously. Quote, vehement as some opposition to certain aspects of Caesar's career undoubtedly was, other exploits and character traits of the soldier, statesman, and dictator were looked upon with distinct approbation by many, unquote. Again, this goes back to that disintegrative interpretations of history via Erasmus. They looked at each tree in that forest as separate and able to like take out of context of the forest. Mm-hmm. They were people who were slapping, though she be but little, she is fierce quotes everywhere.
Right.
Or other quotes that we see about, from Shakespeare.
Taking Polonius quotes where he's basically
to thine own self be true.
Yes.
Also, doubt not the stars are fire.
or
That truth
Malvolio.
to be a liar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all of those quotes that are like tongue in cheek, or we're like, oh, get a look at this guy, but they are being isolated from the context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isolated from the context, they sound a lot more profound or a lot more like empowering
Yeah.
than they are in context. Yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a like strong example of that in just a moment because we have the time.
Woo!
So Caesar's death also features heavily in these commonplace books and in like the way that readers are engaging with Roman history. And readers have a variety of takes on the subject of Caesar's death and regicide, which I'll revisit a little bit later as I get into more of the interpretive, like how we were interpreting. And this comes from, like, it is an individual reader's take on what they are reading. It is early modern book talk or bookstagram.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they are also relating what they're reading to their lives. So in 1618, Simon Dewes, who was a student at Cambridge, compared the conspiracy against Caesar to the gunpowder plot against James I. Quote, giving rise to a diatribe condemning the Catholic attack on the king in the heart of Westminster, Dewes drew a special attention to the parallel between the presaging of Caesar's demise, which he ignored, and the warning letter Mount Eagle brought to James I, unquote.
Wow.
So they're also like personalizing these quotes and in these common books, and when they use these quotes in their further writing, like it is coming from a personal place. So, commonplacing, note-taking, and the understanding of history as a collection of separate events that could be analyzed outside of their surrounding context led readers to each finding something different within the same text, depending on their backgrounds and purposes, like Simon Dewes found that parallel. For example, this student, Alexander Bold, in 1620, writes a draft in preparation to argue for an academic exercise about whether or not Caesar's assassination could be justified. And in his draft writing, he used certain sources to support the view that Caesar's assassination was undeserved and that Caesar was a good man. He also cited other sources for the wickedness of the deed. However, quote, in their original context, the extracts he selected did not directly concern Caesar's death, but Bold excerpted them and placed them into an argument for Caesar's inherent virtue, a virtue so great as to render his killing unjust, unquote. Just like we said, quote out of context, using it for a new
purpose,
for something new. At the same time, this guy, Bold, who crafts this rigorous academic argument to use in a rhetorical exercise, he also recorded such absolute gems as, quote, it was for Pompey to wear as rich a scarf about his leg as other princes about their heads. Caesar first bound the crocodile to the palm tree. The first letter of Caesar's name being strucken with thunder, nothing was left but Isar, which in the Etruscan tongue was a god, denoting that he should die to be deified. Cleopatra send unto her good friend Mark Antony a powdered crane from Asia to Rome, the which he so esteemed, yet he eat every day a morsel of that meat, unquote. So, this guy who's like preparing a very like advanced rhetorical argument using quotes out of context that just like prove Caesar's virtue that have nothing to do with his death.
Yeah.
Is also like, Pompey wore scarves around his leg.
And we're like,
this is also interesting.
Yeah.
So like, who is this? Like,
who is this guy?
So yeah, that very personal. I like thinking about the commonplacing as like modern day book talk or bookstagram where people are highlighting and annotating directly in the books, right?
Yes.
So this commonplacing, that's how people were reading. That's how they were sort of doing the process of interpreting that which they were reading.
I think it's so fascinating that they're interpreting this history for their own history, and they were concerned with like tyrants and civil war when they had just previously had the War of the Roses, and like in the middle of the 1600s they would have another civil war.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like with your facial expression you're going to start getting into this, but that it feels like they manifested that.
Yeah, again, they are responding to things that are, you know, happening. They also, you know, had rebellions that could have turned into civil wars. We just talked about Essex's rebellion, right? Last but not least, I'm going to talk about how they sort of interpreted Roman history more directly. So you're going to hear a few different views because early modern England, not a monolith. Mm-hmm. However, it's interesting to note that, quote, the final decades of the 16th century saw an acceleration of the interest in ancient Rome, which was to continue during the reigns of James I and Charles I, unquote. And this is particularly strong in the drama. Quote, the Roman civil wars between Caesar, Pompey, and Pompey's heirs between 49 and 44 BCE formed the subject matter for a great many dramatic works in the late Elizabethan and Jacobean years, as did Caesar's assassination and the tragic revenge served upon his killers, unquote. These narratives also appeared in other forms of historical writing during this time.
Mm-hmm.
So this was already popular. It is like tripling, quadrupling in interest, like exponentially. The public is becoming more and more interested in Rome. Give us Rome. And as I mentioned earlier, Rome was seen as this like model for early modern England. However, quote, early modern opinion differed as to the legitimacy of Caesar's rule and the validity of the attempt to restore the Republic by removing him from power, unquote. For some early moderns, you know what? Julius Caesar was not a king. Therefore, he did not have divine right to rule and upset the status quo. And these early modern writers may also have seen Julius Caesar as ambitious and not Christian, and therefore justified. The assassination was justified.
Mm-hmm.
He did not have divine right to rule. Therefore, they did the right thing. Others, and sometimes the same authors, because again, they could hold both opinions at the same time, held up Caesar's valor and nobility as worthy models to emulate. Alternatively, other writers saw Caesar as, quote, a good prince who brought order and stability to Rome, unquote. He was seen as personally responsible for the outbreak of civil war in Rome, due to his ambition and conflict with Pompey. He was often depicted as a tyrant, quote, exhibiting contemporary concerns about the abuses of monarchical government, unquote. For example, Thomas Kyd's Cornelia in 1594 has Cicero lamenting that Caesar is a tyrant and that Caesar's ambition has poisoned the state of affairs in Rome. Fletcher and Massinger's The False One, which was likely first written between 1619 and 1620, depicts Caesar in a ruthless pursuit of power and parallels early modern sentiments that were critical of the Jacobean court's decadence. So there are these factions within early modern England that do see Caesar as a tyrant and would be very like pro Brutus and Cassius. Quote, opinion and understanding of Caesar was influenced by centuries of tradition assuming him to be the founder of the Roman Empire, which lived on in early modern Europe as the Holy Roman Empire, unquote. And tensions between Protestant England and the Holy Roman Empire may have added to the reasons why Caesar was interpreted as a bad example, because those writers were seeing him as a stand-in for Spain.
Yeah, I was going to say they're reading it through the lens of what's happening in England for their time. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
This sort of idea as like him as a tyrant who took power that he was not divinely ordained to have also may have been reinforced by English translations of the histories that were originally published on the continent, which had sort of mistranslations of the term imperator, which in Latin was given to all triumphing generals in Rome, and, quote, did not signify monarchy in any way, unquote, but some translators interpret it as, quote, king in all but name, unquote. So this sort of like offensive version of Julius Caesar could have been influenced by, like we were talking about,
mistranslation.
That mistranslation and the connection to Rome. However, James I attempted to associate himself with Julius Caesar, and Francis Bacon, quote, famously expressed his belief that Caesar was a model fit for the king to imitate as far as his learning went, unquote, because Caesar was seen as a very good writer of the works that they were studying. So that's the sort of version of Julius Caesar. He's virtuous, he's a good leader, and then but he does not have any divine right to rule, and therefore was ambitious and should have been punished, deserved what he got. There's also very different interpretations and representations of Julius Caesar's assassination, as early moderns, quote, sought to understand the significance of this revolutionary moment in the context of a world very different from ancient Rome, unquote. And it was often used, this event was often used in schools as a common rhetorical device. Educational theorist of the Protestant Reformation, Philip Melanchthon, quote, prescribed for discussion the question, was Brutus right or wrong in murdering Caesar, unquote. And the various retellings of Caesar's death can be seen as a testament to the legacy of this question being a formative experience in grammar school for young boys. So people return to this again and again and again because they're sort of, everybody's got so what side did you have to take?
Right.
When you got asked the question, was Brutus right or wrong in murdering Caesar? Every single boy who went to school gets asked that question and has to prepare an argument for it.
So of course, Shakespeare, who went to grammar school, has thought about whether Brutus was right or wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is also a complicated event because, as we know from other episodes of this podcast and the research we've done, quote, the question of killing a ruler, lawful or otherwise, was a sensitive one in early modern England, unquote.
Yeah.
And ancient sources, including Cicero, that celebrated the assassination were largely ignored by early moderns. They did not engage with those texts.
Wonder why.
And Julius Caesar was, quote, often thought to have been unjustly killed by those jealous of his success, unquote, when they were trying to be like, was it just? Did he deserve it? Well, he was ambitious. Like, the debate that exists within Julius Caesar is sort of a representation of what sort of everybody is thinking in early modern England. Additionally, another interpretation from the late 1500s through early 1600s was that Julius Caesar's death served as a warning. While those who killed him were motivated by jealousy, the jealousy, quote, was justified because Caesar had overreached himself and arrogated to himself honors and powers to which he had no right, unquote. Again, he did not have the divine right to rule, and that's why it's not regicide, but tyrannicide. Like, that was the logistical loophole that the early moderns sort of figured out for themselves to be able to hold the idea of, like, he deserved it, but we're not talking about killing a king.
Right.
Is what they were saying, yeah. However, quote, authors with more artistic freedom and audiences to entertain sought to contribute to the tyrannicide debate without taking a firm stance. Thus, Shakespeare explores the motivation of all parties in the affair, shaping and manipulating Plutarch to create what Robert Miola calls a supremely ambivalent piece of drama, unquote. Because again, Shakespeare's speaking to a broad audience, so he sort of incorporates all of these interpretations of Caesar and of the assassination within his play, so as to not draw a conclusion one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, like Julius Caesar was wrong for being too ambitious. All the conspirators, except for Brutus, were wrong because they didn't do it for noble reasons. Like, everybody gets to, you know, I don't know. It's so both sidesy. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one, how much the early moderns thought about Rome. It was a lot. They specifically thought about Julius Caesar a lot, which then makes sense why Shakespeare writes, maybe even titles his play Julius Caesar, because we've talked about, like, this is the only play that, you know, the main character, the title character, dies halfway through. Well, if you're trying to draw an audience, why not call the play that you're writing that is about the events surrounding his assassination just his name? Like, it's just a very simple, like, this is the Julius Caesar play.
That's fascinating where Julius Caesar was and the late Roman Republic, Roman Empire were in the consciousness of early modern people. Like, clearly Shakespeare, as a person who went to grammar school, was consumed by these stories and, like, forced to learn these stories, forced to translate these stories, and had to debate some of these finer points that he tackles as a playwright in London. So it makes a lot of sense that, you know, he would turn to these stories when writing plays for the stage. It's not something that's so out of pocket, you know, because he didn't go to a university.
Right. It's like, no, he would have, even in his small schoolhouse in Stratford-upon-Avon, he would have learned. It would have been in depth. He would have learned some Latin. He may not have been the best Latin student, but he would have some knowledge. I kind of like the idea of thinking about, like, for the early moderns, just like Shakespeare today is in the English-speaking world, is so, like, permeates so much of our content. As I said on the Insight interview, The Pit, which is a show on HBO right now, which doesn't need to quote Shakespeare, throws a Shakespeare quote in one script. The amount that Shakespeare permeates our culture today is the amount that Julius Caesar was. So, you know, you don't need to, and, you know, today we get sort of new takes on Shakespeare's plays, and people go, why are we rewriting Romeo and Juliet to give it a happy ending? Or why are we not sticking true to Shakespeare? And this is something that was happening during his time too, is people were taking these very well-known stories that happen to be of the Roman Empire and doing their new takes on them. Today, that is Shakespeare.
Yeah, yeah. And it wasn't just Shakespeare.
No.
The fact that all these other playwrights were doing this, all of these translations were happening, booksellers were selling these books, students had, you know, textbooks about these. It truly is, like, the early moderns were so obsessed with the ancient Romans, and, like, Shakespeare permeates so much of our culture. You know, we're kind of doing the same thing.
I mean, are we not commonplacing?
Yeah, we're commonplacing. We're doing the same thing today.
In a new medium,
and yeah. These Shakespeare plays and these Shakespeare stories, because he's so popular today, or at least so well known. So, I mean, it goes back to what we always say, some things haven't changed.
Some things haven't changed. And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Antony and Cleopatra, Act 3, Scene 13, said by Phidias. The scars upon your honor, therefore, he does pity as constrained blemishes, not as deserved.